Welcome to Berry's In the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
All right, welcome everybody back to In the Interim. I'm your host for maybe the first minute here, Scott Berry, and welcome everybody back. And I have an interesting discussion for you today. I'm going to turn it over to a guest host, and I'll introduce him in a minute, and I'll introduce the podcast. But the other guests that have joined me today are Don Berry, who you've seen on In the Interim. And as far as this concerns, Don has 50 years plus of experience of Bayesian clinical trials. And Lindsay Berry, who is joining us, who has been at Berry Consultants now for 7 years. Do I have that right?
6 years.
6 years. Feels like 7. And has great deal of experience in this time in Bayesian clinical trials. And Nick Berry, who's also been at Berry Consultants now for 6 years.
6.5 years, yes.
And has more experience than Lindsay, as you can hear, in Bayesian clinical trials. So this episode is about Bayesian clinical trials, and the theme of this is that the siblings and grandson and my son, Cooper Berry, who is an undergraduate student at Pitzer College taking a course in the history of mathematics. He wants to do a project on the use of Bayesian statistics in clinical trials and investigate that. And he just so happens to have a wealth of experience within his own family. So he is going to conduct this podcast. He's going to be the host and explore the impact and the future of Bayesian in clinical trials. So Cooper, welcome to In the Interim, and this episode is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I'm very excited for this. I think we can start right ahead with a few questions for Don. So, Don, your dissertation work, it was with a very famous Bayesian statistician. I think you referred to him as one of the founders of Bayesian statistics, Jimmy Savage. He was involved in a lot of different areas, but maybe not clinical trials. What would Jimmy Savage's views of the Bayesian approach today in clinical trials be?
So he, first, this was at Yale. He was my advisor. I came to him with a problem that I thought was interesting. And it wasn't specific, although we did discuss the possibility, and I kept thinking that this is applicable to clinical trials. This is what clinical trials are. And then I got ridiculed by the people who actually run clinical trials. For many years, we're talking about the 1970s and 80s. By the time we got to the 90s, they were used to me, and some were beginning to listen to me. But Jimmy Savage, what would Jimmy Savage have said? Well, he said a lot in reading my dissertation, the 5 versions of it. And none of that had anything specific to do with clinical trials. It was decision-making, sequential decision-making. It's very simple to say what the problem is. Suppose you have 2 coins, and you don't know what the probabilities are of heads, but you're given the opportunity to toss the coin, say 100 tosses, and every time you get heads, you get $1. Every time you get tails, you get nothing. So think in terms of clinical trials. It's you have a treatment you're investigating, and you compare it to another treatment. So you have these two coins, and if you choose a treatment that's good, the patient lives. If you choose a treatment that's bad, the patient does not live. And what your goal is to treat as many patients as effectively as possible, or get as many heads as possible, make as much money as possible. If you're Google, you want to use ads that attract. When somebody clicks on an ad, Google makes money. When you don't click on the ad, Google knows you're looking at it and you didn't click on it. So Google does not make any money. And they want to make as much money as possible. But they also want to, and this is the critical issue, they also want to learn about what is the better therapy, not only treat patients effectively, but also learn about the treatments so that we can treat patients later effectively. Now, this is just to set the context. 1979, there was a Belmont Report in the United States. It was a collection of people. They meant Belmont, I guess. And they put together the ethics of clinical trials. And what they said in this was very counter to what I just said about bandit problems. They said the purpose of doing clinical trials is only to learn, not to treat patients. And they're very explicit about that. And so part of my harangue then and continuing is we can do both. We can combine clinical practice and clinical treatment. Now, doing that is surprisingly difficult. And the reason it's difficult is there are two reasons to pick a coin over the other coin. One is the coin is looking better in terms of its effectiveness, the ability to generate a head. And the other is to learn so that we have information in the long run that's going to help us treat patients in the long run. You know, the last 50 patients would be benefiting of the 100 coin tossers. The last 50 are going to benefit from the first 50, and the first 50 are going to help in benefiting the latter 50. But there's no 50. There's no, discrete aspect to the thing. It's that at every time you're going to toss the coin, you're confronted with just that decision. But that decision has a ramification on the rest of the story. And the reason that it's difficult is because I talk about information, I talk about treating patients. Those two things are not separable. You can't look at one and say, oh, here's the information. You can talk about a standard deviation, for example. You can talk for the treating patients about the mean of the distribution of the probability of heads. But you can't separate them out. And so my dissertation, so picture your problem. You now treated 20 patients, and it turns out that coin 1 was used 12 times and coin 2 was used 8 times. And of the 12 times, there were 9 successes. And of the 8 times, there were 2 successes. What do you do? Well,
Yeah,
you
when is it
recognize-
worth flipping coin 2, even though it's the worst option to get more information on it?
Say it again, Cooper.
When is it worth flipping coin 2, even though it's had worse data, just to get more information on it?
That's an excellent question. The worth of coin 2, we don't know as much about coin 2 as we do about coin 1. And it would be good to get information about coin 2. Better to get information about coin 2 than coin 1, even though coin 1 is looking better. You know, I would want to use coin 1 if I could, but suppose I use coin 1 and then I never go back to coin 2. That would be bad.
Mhm.
Because even though the point estimate of coin 2 was less than coin 1, doesn't mean that the actual probability of heads on coin 2 was less. And so if we never go back to it, that's opportunity lost. And so that's a negative. In this circumstance, I haven't done the calculations. The calculations are really difficult. But I think that coin 1 is indeed appropriate because the information here is not enough to make it worthwhile to treat the current patients potentially less effectively.
But that depends on your horizon, I assume. So if it was
Yes.
if it was 21 patients, the answer is trivial. You do 1. If it's 1 million patients, you might do something different.
That's where I was going, Scott. And yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And with if it's 1,000 patients, I remember Herman Chernoff was a very famous statistician who.
So for this podcast, was he a Bayesian?
He was not a Bayesian.
Okay.
He said to me that he was not a Bayesian.
Okay.
And using Jim Berger as a famous Bayesian, Jim said that anybody who says he's a Bayesian is a Bayesian, although he was telling me about this one person he didn't think was a Bayesian. So my definition is anyone is a Bayesian if they say they're a Bayesian, except for this one person. So Herman Chernoff said that he was not a Bayesian, but he couldn't do what he wanted to do without being a Bayesian. Because in the Bayesian setting, you are able to ask yourself, what is the probability that I get a success on coin 1? What is the probability that I get a success on coin 2? And then if I pick one of those and go to tomorrow where I get to use another coin, I update that. So every time I make an observation, I can update it. And Chernoff wanted to do that. And in this one problem, he wanted to calculate, so how many times would I use coin 2 if it is, I've seen 2 out of 8, and then I'm going to keep using, let's say the horizon is big, and so it tells me I should use coin 2. How many more failures on coin 2 should I accept before I switch back to coin 1? And that, he was advertising to me the calculations that he got. But it was precisely the issue that Scott mentions, that it's the horizon. Anyway, so this whole idea was anathema to the clinical trial community. I was aghast when I actually decided that the only thing I could do to influence them was to join them, and so I did that. I
Well, let's hang on. Let's turn it back to Coop.
Okay, I got. So, what would Savage have thought about randomization and randomized clinical trials? Uh, he would have liked my approach. He did like my approach. He was mostly interested in the theorems and results and the mathematics of my approach. And it, the first draft was 10 pages, and he said, this is great. Maybe we can do more. And the final draft I published in the Annals of Mathematical Statistics was 27 journal pages. And if I tell you what the results were, you would say that, well, that sounds trivial. But the trivial turns out to be very difficult. And in terms of, I'm going to.
So hang on,
So
Don.
Mike,
Hang on, Don.
I
We're
have a
going to
follow-up
run out.
question.
Yeah, let's turn back to Coop.
And so what about a clinical trial makes Bayesian, why was Bayesian looked down upon in terms of clinical trials, especially in this time?
So it depends on the person. If you are a pharmaceutical company, or if you are a National Institutes of Health and you're trying to do things efficiently, that's what they want. They want to get answers quickly, even if the answer is we drop treatment too because it wasn't effective. You want to have a compelling answer to that question. So it's all for the clinical trial community efficacy, and they actually, even today, they don't worry as much about treating patients as effectively in the clinical trials. But this is coming because the diseases are no longer the same diseases that they were back when. They are much more, we have much more information about what this disease is. I mean, there used to be one kind of breast cancer. Now we've decided that there are at least 4, and we separate them out into 4. But in fact, there are hundreds. And so as we continue, we've got to be more and more interested in treating the patients effectively as well as learning. So back to my
Yeah, are there ethical concerns in giving a patient treatment with a prior probability that's lower than a different treatment?
Yes. And the way the clinical trial community addresses it is to close their eyes. So they say, well, we've got to do randomized trials, and we've got to, give equal number of patients to therapy 1 and therapy 2. And we need a trial big enough for us to conclude that one therapy is better than the other. And we're going to have a placebo and randomize to placebo. And nobody's going to know who got the placebo and who didn't. And so they close their eyes. And I don't open my eyes, but I open an algorithm's eyes. I build an algorithm which is looking and does what is appropriate, say, in the bandit approach. We're trying to treat as many patients as effectively as possible. Yeah. There is absolutely ethical concerns with doing that. And it is it is the big deal, really, in getting this kind of an approach in the clinical practice, in the clinical trial practice.
Yeah. Follow-up question. So, Scott, leading into around the year 2000, when you and Don founded Berry, where was your head at with the I Spy 2 trial? Where was your mind on what was Bayesian statistics for you then and relating to clinical trials? And what was it like after the I Spy 2 trial?
Yeah, so I'll go to 2000 and sort of the timeline of this a little bit. So I was trained as a Bayesian. I went to Carnegie Mellon University, where most of our courses were Bayesian. It's a little bit like a language. I think as a Bayesian. I model as a Bayesian. I can translate it to frequentist, and what does that mean relative? So I was doing sports problems. I was solving problems as a Bayesian, and that's how I thought. And then Don and I started Berry Consultants in 2000, and that was my introduction to clinical trials. And as you see, Don has had 20 plus years of experience in them ahead of that. So I jumped into a number of projects with Don, and it was how I modeled, it was how I thought. And so it was a very natural thing for me to go in there. And I was a little naive, not understanding that the world was very frequentist. It was dominated by doing frequentist clinical trials. And this was a very new thing. I Spy 2 is about 10 years after that. In the development was entirely a Bayesian trial within that. But we started this really with the idea of, can we do Bayesian clinical trials? And Don will tell you this, I'll tell you this. We started this with, this might not work. Berry Consultants might last a year. We don't know if Bayesian clinical trials will make it. And now here we are 25 plus years later with more than 30 scientists, and you've got 4 of them here doing Bayesian clinical trials. So to some level, it worked despite the uphill battle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how was
Can I just add the
yeah, absolutely.
So in doing the trial, it's a lot more complicated because you have to know what the data are. You have to build an algorithm that's based on what the data are accumulating, and there's all kinds of logistical issues associated with that. So at the juncture that you're talking about, Cooper, we had a new arm that was coming in the trial. This is a multi-arm trial. It's not 2 arms. It ended up to be 23 arms. A new arm was coming in the trial, and it had some unusual aspect that I wanted to modify. So I went to the people that I worked with to build the I was at MD Anderson. I still am, Cancer Center. And I worked with people there to build the trial. And it was an extensive process of like 2 years, because there were all kinds of things, the mathematics, of course, but demonstrating that we could actually do it. We had some pilot studies at MD Anderson. And more generally, and they had lost the code. This happens, and so I couldn't do what I wanted to do. So I went to Scott, and we did this on a pro bono basis. We never got paid for doing it. And in view of my potential conflicts at MD Anderson, that was appropriate. And I said, Scott, this is what happened. I said, can you rewrite it? Now, of course, he had the benefit of seeing what everybody else had done when was writing it, even though we didn't have the code. And so he rewrote it. How long did it take, Scott?
It was a long weekend. Yep.
And so it was, and we've now come to the point where we can do that more and more quickly. So the building is not a small thing. It's a complicated process, and running is a complicated process. But as you've heard, we're doing it. We're running these trials, despite the logistical issues that arise along the way. With each trial, we learn new things.
Yep. So when you were at Carnegie Mellon, the Markov Chain Monte Carlo methods were starting to appear. They were created. How did that change the debate around Bayesian?
I think it changed it dramatically, actually. A very famous statistician, Brad Efron, wrote a paper, "Why Isn't Everyone Bayesian?" recognizing the benefits of it. And largely the papers was, well, you guys can't actually calculate anything. It's really too hard to do it. It has philosophical advantages. It's nice, but it's really hard to calculate things. And it was true. Many of the models we use now in clinical trials, in the 80s, we couldn't calculate those things. I set up a model for Don in one of his trials, and it ran in our basement for 3 months. This was in 1983 or something like that, and we had to hope the electricity never went out to calculate a very simple model. And so this was very, very challenging. In the 1990s, the Markov Chain Monte Carlo techniques came out, where tied to the computing power made the calculation of all of the Bayesian quantities very doable. In line with doing frequentist things, and in some ways catching up and passing frequentist things. So the whole debate about it was kind of, well, yeah, it looks good, but you can't do it. Now, all of a sudden, we could do it, and we could do it really well. And it changed the debate between Bayesian and frequentist for sure. In every scientific field, clinical trials a little bit slower, but it absolutely changed the debate.
Follow-up question, why was it slower in clinical trials? What specifically about clinical trials made it less applied?
Yeah, I think you might get 4 answers if you ask us all 4, but it largely it was clinical trials were done a particular way, and to do it different is hard to change it. SAS had been developed, and so there were models and calculation available in a frequentist way. And this is the way it was done. And anytime you want to change an industry and do it different, there's stasis there. It's challenging. So it was really just changing the usual way it's done. And a lot of people are set up in that way. I think that was a huge challenge to it.
You know,
So-
the elephant in this room is the regulators. And for many years, the companies and others would say, what will the FDA think? What will the FDA think? And so during the past 20 or so years, the FDA changed their attitudes and some personnel. And they have become very much positive about doing this. And so even in so-called phase 3 trials, the trials that are pivotal, that are used for approving drugs. So it's changing, it's developing. Back to you.
Yeah, so it was 2010, is that correct, when the FDA established guidelines for Bayesian clinical trials?
It's a complicated question. No. It depends what you mean by the FDA. The FDA has 3 distinct pieces. One is the Center for Devices, other is the Center for Biologics, and the other is the Center for Drugs. And so the Center for Devices became very much interested in the Bayesian approach, and they in fact approached me in the 1990s to write a draft guidance for how to do Bayesian things in medical devices. And that was eventually the eventual guidance bore little resemblance to what I had written, but it was about in 2010, yes. But the Bayesian, there is no approved Bayesian guidance, I think, for drugs, but there are guidances for what's called complex innovative designs that specifically includes the Bayesian thing.
The Center for Biologics and Drugs are supposed to have one out. It was supposed to be in September with the government shutdown. Who knows when this comes out, but it's due any day now, is a new guidance.
Okay.
But in terms of the receptibility in the community, when we build these trials, an automaton can run it. And so what we do is run the automaton many times and simulate to evaluate, how likely is it that if you have a drug that's not effective, and this is what the tradition in the FDA has been forever, including as this Belmont Report, is the false positive rate. Suppose I have a drug that's not effective. What is the probability that you that your trial will answer that way? And so the false positive rate is not a Bayesian quantity. It is rather the standard for the frequentist in terms of whether we're doing things well or not. But we can do that with Bayes. And so what we do is we run these trials. We simulate the trial many, many times, millions of times sometimes, to get an accurate assessment of what is the false positive rate. And then that becomes part of the protocol and the approval process. So we do things that are frequentist in order to get them to be used.
Yep. So, Nick, I'm going to turn the page to you here a little bit. When would you consider yourself being a Bayesian statistician in your career? Was it at Iowa State? Was it after Iowa State? What was the frequentist Bayesian debate like when you were at Iowa State?
Okay. So the first question, when did I become a Bayesian statistician? I'll say when I was like 16 years old, probably. Just growing up around Scott and doing things like playing board games and strategy. And I remember looking over his shoulder and doing like little problem solving things on the computer. And I think it's like a method of thinking that was sort of ingrained in me. This, sort of sequential update idea of Bayesian. And so I think I learned a lot about, well, what's the probability this will happen in the board game? And can you make a decision that maximizes some win condition given that probability? And so it's sort of a introduction to Bayesian statistics through that. And then I went to Iowa State, and maybe my Bayesian arc kind of took a dip because Iowa State's not a very Bayesian department. So I started fast and then leveled out, and I didn't write a Bayesian dissertation. I didn't have a Bayesian advisor. At Iowa State, you had to go out of your way and take electives if you wanted to learn about Bayesian statistics. Not that it was a taboo subject, just that it wasn't part of the core curriculum for the most part. And so I, of course, did that and took Bayesian classes. But my learning kind of stalled in the sense that Scott described it being a language that he spoke and it being just innate and, pervasive in the department. Wasn't really an experience I had. It was something that you talked about as an alternative to the real way to do it or something like that. And so sort of leveled out. I did, and I've always been a little focused on computation. And so one thing I did think about and talk about and research when I was in school was MCMC methods, Markov Chain Monte Carlo. And I think that set me up really nicely for my eventual career as a Bayesian statistician. And I still think of myself as sort of a computational heavy statistician, but I can't. So maybe the modeling aspect of it is the part that sticks out to me the most, just the ability to estimate these really general models using this kind of all-in-one toolkit that is MCMC. And so that sort of has drawn me to it as someone that's always on the computer, always programming, is having this MCMC toolkit just makes everything so available. Whereas with the frequentist method, is there a package that does this sort of, what is this? Can I get a confidence interval for this combination of parameters and things like that I was always thinking about just become inherently natural. And it's just such a smooth way to do modeling. And so now I've gone up, as I described at Berry. I, had been immersed in Bayesian methods for 6 years now, 6.5 years, and I'm back on the way up.
So if you had 2 words to describe the difference between Bayesian and non-Bayesian, it would be decision making. And if you look at some definitions of statistics, it says decision making under uncertainty. But that's not the frequentist approach. You can make decisions, of course, the frequentist approach, but it's not specifically part of it. When Savage wrote his fundamental book, The Foundations of Statistics, the one thing that came out, of course, was the Bayesian. But the other thing that came out of his efforts was he wanted to have a utility function, or why are we doing this? What is the purpose? And what do we conclude based on what we've done? So it leads to, as part of the foundation, putting the two together, the decision making and the data analysis. Data analysis without decision making, it's not, can't be Bayesian. Bayesian has the two of them together, and that involves modeling very frequently. Strategies.
So Cooper, are you muted?
Yeah. So my follow-up question is, where are we at in the history of Bayesian right now? When you look at what's going on now with AI revolutionizing almost every field, how does that affect Bayesian, and where are we going with Bayesian? Is it on the way down? Is it on the way up? Is it just starting? I'll start with Nick, and then we can go all the way around with everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So AI. So do you know who Geoffrey Hinton is? He's a computer scientist that was at the University of Toronto for a long time, now known as like the godfather of AI. He essentially invented, in a way, neural networks by inventing backpropagation, which is now used to like get the weights and estimate all the parameters that go into like these billion parameter models. He is a Bayesian as a computer scientist. He's talked about Bayesian statistics and thinks like a Bayesian, as tweets about subjective probabilities that the human race will be extinct because of AI in the next 30 years and things like that. So he thinks like a Bayesian. He has students that have done great things. Bradford Neal is a Bayesian, wrote his dissertation about Bayesian estimation of neural networks. And so there are Bayesians doing amazing stuff in AI, fitting these large language models. They're at the forefront of AI. But Bayesian methods are not used in any of the state-of-the-art models. Bayesian ideas probably are, but they're not estimating posterior distributions for these parameters. It's impossible just because of the magnitude of it. Even now, we don't have enough compute power to do it. It's just not feasible. So I think Bayesian has had a huge impact. Bayesian statistics had a huge impact on people doing deep learning. Right now, it's not implemented in the state-of-the-art models, I don't know if in 30 years, like now we look back and say we couldn't estimate this model that's now, 4 lines in Stan. But in 40 years, are we going to look back and say, okay, we can now get joint posteriors for these parameters in the model, and we have uncertainty about these things that we can combine. So I think it seems impossible looking at it now to do anything like MCMC on those parameters, but maybe some variational inference or some more direct way to sample from these will lead to progress.
Yeah. So, Lindsay, you went to Duke. I understand that it's a more Bayesian graduate school. What was the frequentist versus Bayesian debate like when you were in graduate school, and starting at Berry, what was the transition like?
Yes. So I guess I won't tell you if I'm a Bayesian, but the prior is I am Dawn's granddaughter and I'm Scott's daughter. So that's your prior. You can form your prior from that. And then I did my undergrad at UT Austin in math, and I took classes from James Scott, who was a Duke Stats PhD, and he taught intro statistics, including Bayesian statistics. And then I went to Duke to get my statistics PhD, and I was taught by Mike West was my advisor. Jim Berger is at Duke. David Dunson, famous Bayesian statisticians. So anyway, based on that data, you can update your posterior and guess whether you think I'm a Bayesian or not. But yeah, I mean, I think where I land is that I agree with Scott. When it comes to modeling, I think like a Bayesian. And, my research was in essentially sequential forecasting. So you are getting updated information every day about sales of an item in a supermarket. And your goal is forecasting, how many items will we sell tomorrow? Will we sell in 2 days, in 14 days? And so it's just natural to attack that problem from a sequential learning framework of, how many did we sell yesterday, the next day, the day after that, continuously updating your posterior to forecast. So it's just natural. I guess I feel like, as Dawn said, we have to speak both languages, though. We can't. We use frequentist methods even here at Berry, and we speak the frequentist language, and we try to use Bayesian methods where they're appropriate, and we feel like they're adding a lot of value. So I think that balance is really important for me. And then I guess I can talk about my transition here at Berry was pretty unique, and we talked about some of the barriers of Bayesian in clinical trials, and one of those is just it's not what's traditionally done, and when you're going against that status quo, you run into those challenges getting new ideas across. I joined Berry in the summer of 2019, and I had a nice 6-month period of learning how clinical trials are done, and then at the end of 2019, the COVID pandemic started ramping up. And I really think that was a point where we were forced very quickly to change how we do things. And early in 2020, I was brought on to a project called REMAP-CAP. And this is an adaptive platform trial that had existed already, studying patients with community-acquired pneumonia. And the platform was kind of designed to be prepared for a future pandemic because they thought, it was very likely a respiratory influenza pandemic or some other pandemic could occur, and they wanted to be ready to pivot to study patients with those diseases. So I think COVID really forced us. We had to be Bayesian. We had to be adaptive. We were faced with so much uncertainty at that time. What was this pandemic going to, how far was it going to spread? How serious was it going to be? How many patients could we enroll in a disease? There was so much uncertainty during that design stage that we couldn't do the traditional thing of running one-to-one trials, fixed power calculations. We had to be adaptive. We had to do frequent interim analyses. So I think that was a very unique experience, and it's now paved the way, I think, for people to have more acceptance of Bayesian methods of adaptive platform trials.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in the next pandemic that a Bayesian approach will be taken?
Yes, I think it kind of has to be. I mean, I think, one of the benefits is just, I think you can't just focus on the trial that you're running. Things are happening outside the trial. You're learning constantly. There's external data emerging, and, being able to either incorporate that into the analysis in a formal way, or, to stop a treatment and then still have an interpretable result. I think, yeah, absolutely.
Got it. Awesome. So now looking to the future a little bit. So Don, it's been about over 50 years and you've seen Bayesian clinical trials grow. You've seen Monte Carlo methods, Markov Chain Monte Carlo methods. And now looking towards AI, what is Bayesian statistics to you going forward? Are you happy with where things are going? Are you pessimistic? Where's your head at with it?
So, depends what you mean by AI. There are various definitions, but the notion of learning is fundamental. You teach something to teach itself, what to do in the context of the process. And so it's, this is what we do. So in a sense, the algorithm that I mentioned is AI. I mean, it's learning. It has many possibilities that it can do. And as it's built to learn. And as it learns, it makes decisions. And in what I've read about artificial intelligence is it's all in decisions and making decisions. And as I said before, making decisions means Bayes. I mean, you can't really do it without Bayes. Hermann Chernow. I'm not Bayesian, but I use Bayesian because I have to. It's the only thing that lets me do what I want to do. And that is a summary of what happens in artificial intelligence and what happens in AI. So I think the future is Bayes. As to, artificial intelligence to me is scary. And I'm not convinced that Bayesian analyses won't be used for some of the scary things that might happen. So who knows what's going to happen? As Yogi Berra said, prediction is difficult, especially the future.
And so if we picture Bayesian as a sort of timeline, and let's start the timeline the first quarter of a game at you doing bandit problems. Where are we at right now at this point in time? What quarter of a football game? What time period? Are we at halftime yet? Are we still in the first quarter? Is it almost over? In terms of Bayesian methods.
Who are you passing the ball to with that one?
That's a tough one. Anyone have any strong?
I have an answer, and I don't know, I'm just kind of making stuff up here. So I think right now we do a lot of Bayesian inference, and we might run a Bayesian trial, and at the end of the trial we report a posterior probability of benefit from a treatment. I think what's missing is the decision-making piece Don was just describing. A lot of times we just leave it there. Here's our posterior probability. What are we supposed to do with that, though? And how should a clinician use this treatment? Should a regulator approve a drug? I think that second piece is underrepresented in analysis of clinical trials and design. And so I think I would say we're maybe at halftime. We are using some of the tools of Bayesian statistics, but not all of them. And I think there's a lot of promise from decision theory that is yet to be discovered.
I'll be bold and say that I'm not even sure the game has started yet, because I think there's going to be an incredible explosion of data. And we've seen that a little bit in the 25 years. When I started doing this 25 years ago, there was no data outside of a clinical trial. And Frequentist is kind of good at analyzing a single trial result. It's what it does. Now we have these incredible sources of data, and in some cases we have that now, and we're changing the way we're doing trials by incorporating that data, incorporating that on a much grander scale about exactly what Lindsay and Don said, decision making. The only way to synthesize the incredible amount of data that's coming in clinical trials, but outside of clinical trials, will be Bayesian. I think we're going to see this incredible growth, and it'll be an interesting thing, the history of mathematics, the class you're in, looking back at this at some point. I think we're going to see this huge explosion on it. But I interrupted Nick. Your prediction.
Yeah, I won't let your answer swing me. I'll stick to what I was going to say originally, which is I think we're at the 2-minute timeout at the end of the first half. It feels like we're not at halftime yet, and we're actually in, like, at least in the clinical trials context, in this sort of mad dash. Like, these things are getting accepted. They're being used in, a lot of trials, regulatory trials. People that aren't in Berry are designing Bayesian trials. It's not just us. And so I feel like we're in this 2-minute drill to get to halftime. We're leading up to something, but moving at a really fast pace right now. And maybe we'll get to some stasis in some short time where, okay, we plateaued. There's no questions about Bayesian clinical trials. You do them. Here's how they're done. Here's the history. Like, here's a backlog of things you can look at for other people doing them. And then we'll see how the second half goes, which maybe is Scott's thing about synthesizing these massive amounts of data, and things like that.
Do you think your job, Nick, specifically facts related, is going to get easier or harder as we get more data?
Oh, facts related, as in developing our software, I think it probably gets harder. Harder in the sense that we try to create software that is generally useful to a lot of people. And as the problem space gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and people have different types of external data and they want to use it in different ways, the capabilities that we have to provide to users grow really, really, really fast. So I think it probably, it'd be much easier to write a clinical trial design software that just simulated fixed frequentist clinical trials. And so I think as we get more data, more models, more methods for combining data, it probably gets harder, but also more useful, right? If we have something that allows people to do it quickly, they don't have to know how to program something in Stan. They don't have to work on hierarchical priors and stuff like that. It can open the door for a lot more people to use these methods. So, yeah.
Don, how about you? Where are we at in the Bayesian bowl game?
I'm 2 minutes. Well, like all Bayesians, I have a probability distribution. And my probability distribution has a mean of the 2-minute mark. We're 2 minutes into the game. But the distribution is really has a large variance, large standard deviation. The critical thing to modify what Nick was saying, Scott was saying, is something about the data. What are the data? The data are not simply adding more things and more patients but it's the biology. Biology today in every disease is a far cry from biology 50, even 20 years ago. And we learn more about the diseases and more about the individual aspects of the diseases. You have two patients and they look the same. Let's say they have breast cancer and you're the same age and you have breast cancer and a said breast and the size of the two breast cancer is the same. Everything looks the same. And one dies and the other lives and dies of heart disease. We talk in medicine about precision medicine. We're learning more and more about the patient characteristics. And soon, and it's this thing that I mentioned about, there are many categories of any disease, and every disease is becoming more and more categorized. And it is that kind of data that we confront when we do trials, and we ask about the artificial intelligence. We ask, about how's the therapy doing in this type of patient, or are there other things that we should be measuring? And if it looks like it's better in that type of patient, maybe we should use the therapy for that patient, but not for another patient. And so that's the kind of thing that we did in iSpy 2, but it really is the future, and all of these are decisions and therefore Bayes. So I think the future is bright. I think all of us worry that because it seems so bright, there's going to be a lot of people trying to do it. And frankly, not everybody can do it. And they need our help. But there are certainly lots of people out there who can help us just as well as we can.
That's great. And I'll ask one more closing question here. So clearly, Bayesian statistics has somewhat of a grasp on our family. What is it about Bayesian that makes it so appealing for statisticians? What is the one core item of it that makes it so appealing?
You said what makes it appealing to statisticians. I think it's just appealing to humans because Bayesian statistics is the way a human thinks and learns. So, you start out, you don't know much about something, and then you gather some data and you update your beliefs as you do that. And that's a sequential process. I think that's how you change your mind. And I just think that's such a fundamental concept that people get it. We work with a lot of clinicians and that's how they think. They see one trial result and another trial result and they kind of, as they go, learn how to treat patients. So I think it's that concept that's so appealing about it to not just our family, but I think a lot of people.
Is this appeal different than the appeal of an adaptive trial over a non-adaptive trial?
So I think it is different, but it
think it's different.
utilizes exactly what Lindsay said. Once you adopt and recognize the beauty of, I learned something, how does it update my knowledge? Now I want to keep updating my knowledge. I want to learn something. And the idea of now doing sequential experiments when we can do sequential learning, it's the natural thing. The idea that we will wait 3 years before we look at the data is just completely the opposite of the Bayesian view. Nick?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I agree with what Lindsay said, obviously. And then for me, it's the toolkit. It's the modeling. I don't know, the ability to estimate hierarchical models, draw them as this, these trees, and then have your hyperpriors and estimate these hierarchical models with shrinkage. It's like, it's such an incredibly powerful tool that you can't help be like drawn to the light by, like a moth, right? You keep seeing it as you're in statistics, as hierarchical models, and you can't help but like be drawn to this Bayesian estimation of parameters and the, borrowing and hyperpriors. It's such an elegant, nice way to do it. And now that we can estimate these parameters so well, it's just that much more powerful. With not a lot of startup that has to go into this. Like, there's not a lot of cost to doing it that way.
So for me, you get a story. I agree with Lindsay. I agree with Scott. The Bayesian approach is natural. There's a very famous statistician, the most famous statistician in the world ever was, father of modern statistics, Ronald Fisher. He was Sir Ronald Fisher. He was a statistician at Rothamsted Agricultural Institute and developed. He defined p-values. He invented randomization. He invented factorial designs. He's regarded by virtually every statistician that I know as almost a god. So what would he think? You asked Cooper about what Savage would think. What would he think about randomization in clinical trials? And he was actually asked that question. He worked in agriculture. And by the way, he hated people who would run experiments asking one question. He said, you have to ask lots of questions. And we do that. But the one question that he was asked by a statistician, because that's the statistician asking the question was interested in whether the god of randomization would think that it's appropriate to randomize patients in clinical trials. And Fisher had no experience with, no knowledge of clinical trials. But he said, I suppose what you would do is you would calculate a p-value, thinking p-values instead of Bayesian statistics. You would calculate a p-value for your current data, and then tomorrow you would calculate another p-value for the current data and use some function of the p-value to assign randomly, but biased randomly, biased in favor of the therapy that is doing better. And that's the kind of thing that we do, that we did in I Spy 2. And it's natural. I mean, you don't want to ignore. Here's a person faced with this question from another statistician who doesn't want to ignore the randomization, but wants to do it right. Nick asked the question, even in that circumstance, about ethics. Yes, there are ethics associated with it. But especially if you could, combine the things going on in randomized trials with Fisher's concern about treating patients that things are developing. The AI, the algorithm is telling us whether it's a p-value or posterior probability. Somebody else, somebody named Thompson, did wrote a paper back in 1933, essentially what Fisher said, but a Bayesian calculation instead of a p-value. It probably doesn't make any difference or much difference as to what you're using, depending on what function it is, but evaluating with simulation. And by the way, to one of Scott's earlier points, Fisher could never have simulated his proposal, nor could Thompson, because it's complicated. Many simulations that you have to do and many scenarios. And by the way, Fisher would be asking other questions too. So how do you incorporate that? And it's the age of the computer and the ability to do things. And so it's natural even to this god of statistics.
Okay, so I am going to grab back control of the host duty, Cooper. Thank you for coming on. A wonderful conversation. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. And I want to thank everybody for spending time in the interim. Until the next one. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Coop.